This is For the Rest of Us with Ken and Megan Castellan, a podcast about theology, faith, the Bible, and life. You know, for the rest of us. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to For the Rest of Us with the Reverend Ken and Megan Castellan. You know by now, but I feel like I have to keep saying it. I am clearly not the Reverend Ken and Megan Castellan. I am Adam Eichelberger. I work with Megan at the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York. I'm a lifelong Catholic now. I'm a toddler Episcopalian because I'm growing up, and I'm just trying to make sense out of everything, and Megan's going to try and help me do that through the lens of the Episcopal faith. If this were The Simpsons, you could consider me like the Lenny.
I'm a good work guy.
To her Carl.
Hey, I don't know about you, but they're not exactly winning me over with these lousy production values here.
As she just tries to help me figure this all out. Welcome to part 3 of our multi-part series about apartheid in South Africa, everyone's favorite thing.
Yay!
Just a cheery, sunshiny topic. So Megan, what do you have to explain this episode for the rest of us?
So this episode, we're going to be talking about the Anglican Church's response to apartheid, our theological response. And this is my way into the rabbit hole. This is why I started kind of investigating this to begin with. The Anglican Church historically has not been super revolutionary. That's not been our deal. We've been the church of government. We've been the church of staying calm and carrying on. And so I was really curious how it was that in South Africa, we ended up being arrested a lot and leading protest marches and getting Nobel Peace Prizes for leading a nonviolent resistance movement. And so then I kind of dragged us all down this lovely rabbit hole. So as we've been saying, apartheid in South Africa was, number one, very evil. Number two, explicitly fostered and promoted by the dominant strain of Christianity among the white South Africans at the time. However, as we've also said, there were kind of two groups of white South Africans in South Africa. There were the kind of Dutch Afrikaners, and there were the English-speaking British colonial people. And because of these two distinct cultural groups, you also had two distinct groups of churches. You had the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the one that promoted apartheid. And then you had the English-speaking churches, and they remained entirely distinct throughout this entire period, still are to this day. So on the one hand, you had the Dutch Reformed Church, which I'm going to call the DRK, and its sort of daughter churches. And on the other hand, you have groups like the Anglicans, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, some local Baptists, not Southern Baptists, but cool Baptists, and the rest, all of whom did not endorse apartheid at all. And all of whom were to some extent outspoken against apartheid from the start. And for the Anglican Church, part of this had to do with our history. So the first Anglican chaplains, and this also explains why the Anglican Church in South Africa ends up becoming distinct from the rest of Anglicanism throughout the African subcontinent, which will probably end up being another podcast episode. And if you know about the Anglican Communion and its internal politics, this is something you probably already come across. But the first Anglican chaplains came to what became South Africa with the military when the British invaded to fight the Dutch. And then the first lay missionaries came from India and not from England itself. And until the church in South Africa requested its own bishop from England, all of the missionaries came to South Africa via Calcutta instead of from England itself, which led to a couple things. One, we haven't gotten all white nationalists up in South Africa yet for the Anglican Church, which is good. Two, it led to a more Anglo-Catholic style of worship than the missionary activity throughout the rest of Africa. You already have a lot of Calvinist influence for the Afrikaners. Everybody hanging out with Calvin in the Netherlands and in France. Not to say there's not Calvinist influence in the Anglican Church. There definitely is. But by this point, the people who are showing up in Cape Town from the Anglican Church are from the Oxford movement, are Tractarians, are High Church. And they stake out another corner of Christendom which is more Anglo-Catholic and ritualistic. And the first bishop that kind of solidifies the Anglican Church. One of the things that he pushes for is to make the South African Anglican Church separate from the government of South Africa. So unlike other British colonies that are being set up around the world, Bishop Gray decides that the South African Anglican Church will be entirely independent and distinct from the government of the British colony of South Africa. So the constitution that they signed in the 1860s and 70s specifies that the secular government of South Africa will have no role in any church decisions whatsoever. This seems to be because he got on the wrong side of Parliament in England, and so he was still bitter about it. He also seems to have been a crappy bishop in most other ways. But every pig finds a truffle sometimes. We'll take it. What seems to have happened over the years is that the Anglican Church in South Africa, like other English-speaking churches, never got on board with apartheid because we took the Bible seriously and because we were not explicitly part of the government at all. We did not feel obligated to defend the decisions of the government. And so throughout the development of apartheid as a system, from when South Africa became independent in the 1930s, the Anglican bishops in particular and the Anglican clergy openly and freely and consistently denounced the practices of apartheid. However, that opposition waxed and waned. And I found an article written by a South African Anglican minister who was white from, I believe, the 50s, which says the following. The whole article is some of the most cutting, blistering attack on his own church that I think I've ever read. It's really great. And he later gets arrested by the South African government for protesting apartheid. So good on him. But this is part of what the article says. In practice, a curious and saddening contradiction is at once apparent. What is accepted as theologically indisputable also seems to be dismissed as practically inexpedient, if not impossible. The teaching, and by that he means the ability of all humanity to live together, is not carried into the everyday world of actual relationships, and Christ's plea for family unity remains but a piously held and beautiful philosophy. In spite of the fact that Anglican churchmen hold controlling positions in commerce and industry, including the gold mining houses, and are therefore able to force changes upon the government in a more Christian direction, hardly any use at all has been made of such opportunities as have arisen. On the contrary, it was the Anglican business interests in Natal which approached the government with requests to apply the Group Areas Act in the Union for the first time to protect them from the competition of Indian traders. Anglican lay opinion, expressed in the various synods throughout the years of crisis, has been notoriously and obstructively conservative toward any suggested opposition to the government. Nothing, it seems, must be done which it could in any way prejudice business interests. Rather, patience must be exercised in the hope that something will happen to unseat the present administration. So he's not happy. He's not happy with how aggressively the church is fighting apartheid. He says that basically the Anglican leadership and clergy are willing to say, yeah, this is bad, but they're not willing to put much emphasis in it. And the congregation of Anglicans is just willing to say, yeah, one day Jesus will change it, but what are we going to do? It's, it is what it is. As time goes on, a couple things happen to begin to turn the tide. For one thing, we get Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu was part of a push within the church to have more Black clergy in the church. Again, the church was never officially segregated, but it kind of was accidentally wink, wink, nudge, nudge segregated. So there was a definite kind of orchestrated, okay, we need to fix this about ourselves. And Desmond Tutu kind of comes along. In general, he was the first Black person to occupy a lot of the jobs that he held. First Black Archbishop of South Africa, first Black Bishop of Johannesburg, first Black Archbishop of Cape Town. He was a Nobel laureate. He was a generally saintly human being. He grew up in a family that was poor but not destitute. His parents were teachers. He was sick a lot as a kid. He had polio, and then he got TB when he was a teenager. And when he had tuberculosis, he was visited in the hospital by the local Anglican priest, who was Trevor Huddleston. Trevor Huddleston is notable because he was a huge anti-apartheid activist in his own right, and goes on when he goes back to England, becomes the Archbishop of the province of the Indian Ocean and was really beloved and well known for his own activities around justice, was a huge influence on Desmond Tutu and was the person who convinced him to become a priest himself. He becomes an honorary member of the African National Congress. He gets to vote in the first election because everyone loved him so much. He's this kind of towering figure in his own right, is a kind of big part of the story. So the baby Desmond Tutu trains as a teacher because his parents couldn't afford to send him to school and the government doesn't authorize further education funding for Black students. He worked as a teacher until 1953 when the nationalist government further restricts education for Black students. So they further restricted the things that could be taught to Black kids. And in protest, Desmond and his wife Leah both quit. And at this time, Trevor Huddleston says, "Why don't you become a priest?" And he says, "Oh, that's a good idea." He goes to London to study for a little bit, and for the first time, he kind of realizes what life could be like as a free person, as a person kind of unfettered by apartheid and kind of being put in these boxes. He returns to South Africa both to teach theology to others and to continue to work as a priest. And he very quickly becomes a very prominent anti-apartheid voice in the movement. This is also the time when it's the 60s, so you have other African colonies gaining their independence. You have Black consciousness becoming a thing in the United States. You have the civil rights movement. So a lot of things are happening at once, and you have a real wave of protest and freedom kind of sweeping the globe. And that kind of picks up the anti-apartheid movement and shifts it into a new gear. So Desmond Tutu becomes first the Dean of St. Mary's Cathedral in Johannesburg. It's either in Johannesburg or Cape Town, which was an effectively integrated cathedral. And that had a really big impact on him. He writes about seeing all of God's children worshiping together, singing together, everybody in their own language, and having like a vision of the kingdom of God, that this is what God wants for God's people. He's elected Bishop of Lesotho after a couple months, and then he is appointed the head of the South African Council of Churches. So this is the only ecumenical organization that gathers all of the English-speaking churches in South Africa. This is the middle of the 70s. Gathers all of the English-speaking churches in South Africa, plus the predominantly Black and Indian churches together. So it's a big force in the ecumenical world. And Desmond Tutu changes it into one of the foremost voices in human rights work at the time. Because you've got the Soweto uprising, you've got all of these protest movements beginning to happen. And so he kind of pushes the South African Council of Churches into having a major role in all of that work. Leading protests, he was being a pastoral presence to people who'd been taken prisoner. He was teaching clergy. He also was introducing modern liturgies in the cathedral. He was introducing gender-neutral pronouns for God. He was urging the adoption of women's ordination, like you name it. Desmond Tutu was out here like negotiating for the release of Nelson Mandela and taking care of his wife and bringing her communion every week. He was doing all the things. One of the things I like about his life is that when he took over the South African Council of Churches, he instituted daily prayers, twice daily prayers for the staff, monthly silent retreats, monthly Eucharists, and weekly Bible studies. He was a big believer in, if we're going to be a Christian organization, no, we're really going to be a Christian organization. He also believed, shout out to Kathy Hobart, also believed in financial audits. So one of the cornerstones of his administration is that he brought in financial auditors to go through all the books and stopped some skimming from the finances that had been going on under the previous administration, and introduced a lot of transparency to the paperwork that had been flourishing under his predecessor. So he believed in prayer and financial audits, which is fantastic.
Our first official Kathy Hobart shout out on
Right.
the podcast.
Two cornerstones of all excellent saints. It's worth noting that the government came to despise the South African Council of Churches so much that they launched a government commission specifically to investigate them in 1982 called the Elaf Commission, which we'll get into in a minute. They accused him of doing all sorts of treasonous and seditious activity, and they removed his passport. So he wasn't allowed to leave the country. And they arrested his wife a couple times. He was Tutu was elected Bishop of Johannesburg and then Archbishop of Cape Town and then Archbishop of all of South Africa, becoming the first Black person to hold all of those roles. And the government was really not happy because he was really outspoken. Like we said last week, Desmond Tutu was very clear about what he thought about apartheid. He did not pull punches. You asked him what he thought about apartheid, and he would tell you flat out, apartheid is evil. There is no if, ands, or buts. Apartheid is evil. It is blasphemous against the children of God. It destroys the image of God in humanity. Evil. It's bad. Don't do it. And from the late 70s on, he openly called for an economic boycott of South Africa. And because of his ecumenical work and his connections in England and to the rest of the Anglican Communion, he had a pretty global platform. He got honorary degrees from General Theological Seminary, my alma mater, and Harvard University. And so he was becoming too prominent to quietly disappear, which was a larger problem for the South African government. And so during the Truth and Reconciliation process, when all of the government files were opened, the government admitted to trying to assassinate a lot of anti-apartheid Christian leaders, but later claimed that they never tried it with Desmond Tutu because he was too well known. Still a little iffy on that. So the thing I want to talk about with Desmond Tutu is, he's a generally saintly person. You can't say enough good about him. He tells good jokes, like just a tremendous human being. But it's his theology that I think is the most instructive for us. So in reading a book called Hope and Suffering, which is a collection of his sermons and speeches, which was published in 1982. So before he even becomes a bishop and kind of high muckety muck, he is writing all of these sermons and preaching all of these sermons that, again, are incredibly consistent and incredibly blunt about what he thinks is wrong. Apartheid, I disappeared. Apartheid is incredibly evil. There's no question about it. And so, he always says, the question before the nation is not, will apartheid survive? Because apartheid absolutely cannot survive. There is no way. God is the master of the universe, and therefore apartheid must and will fall. There is absolutely no question about that. God is a God who saves the oppressed. God saves the Israelites from the Egyptians, and so God is going to overthrow apartheid. There can be no confusion about that. That is the nature of God. That is what God will do. God will overthrow apartheid. The question is always when and how is that going to happen? Is that going to happen with our cooperation? Will that happen quickly? And will we work to make sure that the overthrow of apartheid is swift and nonviolent for everyone's good? Will we work together to bring into being the world that can be where everyone is respected and honored and dignified? Or will we choose to resist and drag it out? And will the downfall of apartheid be slow and painful and end in an endless cycle of violence that we will never be able to recover from? Because either way, Tutu would say, apartheid is going down, and our choice is how will that happen? And he also would kind of tag on to that the church has a choice to make too. If the church chooses to defend the status quo, if the church chooses to sanctify the order of things that are, the church is going to collapse too, and justly so. He says, like the Roman Catholics in Rwanda, and like the Anglicans and then the Roman Catholics in Zimbabwe, the church will not survive failing to side with God in the mission of liberation. And so either we join with God to liberate God's people, or we will not survive as a church. And he goes back to this theme again and again and again and again. And it's really hopeful, which is interesting, because you would expect sermons given in the heart of apartheid at funerals for people who'd been murdered by the state to be kind of endless laments and kind of, list of grievances and everything is awful and we know God condemns all of this. And he doesn't do that. He just says, the day is coming when all of this will be cast down. And we know that because our God is a God of justice. And there's no doubt of that. And I want you to know that God sees your suffering and God sides with you, and this is not going to last forever. And so the question for us is, what will we do about that? And it's a really like, okay, I'm gonna fight all the things now. That could just be me. And the final speech in the book is the presentation he gives to the commission that was investigating the South African College of Churches, and it's amazing. Like, I want someone to, like, tattooed on my forehead and, like, just run around with sparklers yelling how great it is. He talks about, here we go. I'm going to restrict myself from reading the entire 20 pages of a presentation, but I can do it. If anyone were to show me that apartheid is biblical or Christian, I have said before and I reiterate now that I would burn my Bible and cease to be Christian. I want to show that the Christian Bible and the gospel of Jesus Christ our Lord is subversive of all injustice and evil, oppression and exploitation, and that God is on the side of the oppressed and the downtrodden, that he is the liberator, God of Exodus, who leads his people out of every kind of bondage, spiritual, political, social, and economic, and nothing will thwart him from achieving the goal of the liberation of all his people and the whole of his creation. Yeah.
Good to hear that he doesn't mince words about this.
He does not. He does not. And he then he goes into, we answer only to God, like we don't recognize your stupid commission. He says, the government appointed this commission for a reason that is perfectly obvious and totally unsubtle. It has used commissions before to deal with awkward customers. I don't impugn the integrity of this commission and its members in any way, but I want the government to know now and always that I do not fear them. They are trying to defend the utterly indefensible. Apartheid is as evil and as vicious as Nazism and communism, and the government will fail completely, for it is ranging itself on the side of evil, injustice, and oppression. The government is not God. They are just ordinary human beings who very soon, like other tyrants before them, will bite the dust. When they take on the SACC, they must know that they are taking on the Church of God, and those who have done so in the past, the Neros, the Hitlers, the Amins of this world, have ended up, as I have said before on other occasions, as the flotsam and jetsam of history. Christ has assured us that his church is founded on rock, and not even the gates of hell can prevail against it. The resurrection of our Lord and Savior declares for all to know that life will triumph over darkness, that goodness will triumph over evil, that justice will triumph over injustice, and that freedom will triumph over tyranny. I stand before you as one who believes fervently what Paul wrote when he said, if God is for us, who can be against us? Heck yeah. I mean, I think you really can't add much to that. One of the reasons I kind of like it so much and want to tattoo it on my forehead, which I won't do. That's going to be a weird look for me. But that's the thing people need to hear is, and a lot of times in the church we talk about, oh, we can't take sides. We can't choose a position. We can't be political. He has a whole nother section on what political means. But people need to hear, because people know that this is wrong. People know what wrong is. People understand that feeling of, this is wrong. This feels wrong. People are being kidnapped off the streets. This feels wrong. This is bad. But the thing I think the church is called to do that he did so well, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, is that in times where everything is going wrong and the church is called to speak out against it, it's not so much our call to say, this is wrong, because we've covered that. Like, we know that part. It's our call to say, this is wrong, and so it's not going to stand, because our God is a God of goodness and justice, and so God won't let this last forever. Our job, therefore, is to resist and to aid God in the coming of justice, not to overthrow things ourselves, but to help in that regeneration, because we are secure in the knowledge that resurrection comes on Sunday morning, and that nothing is going to, even if something happens to us, nothing stops the, Easter morning, which is a very different approach than kind of lambasting the powers that be.
Yeah, this is, I think one of the really important things about all of this is, and we've said it before, eerily similar to things that are happening in our world around us, especially here in America. And I think it's really easy to give into like the hopelessness
Yeah.
of everything. And when you look at the example that Desmond Tutu sets for us as Episcopalians, as all Christians, really, yeah, we know it's wrong.
Mhm.
We're not going to dwell on how wrong it is. We are going to stand and say, that God says this will not, like you said, God says this will not stand.
Yeah.
And work for that. And it's interesting that you talked about like the nearly impossible Venn diagram of how quickly it can happen and how non-violently it can happen. And that sliver where they actually intersect is pretty slim, but that's where we're called to stand. That's where Tutu stood. Again, side note, I always have a hard time saying his last name, not because I can't say it, but because I feel silly saying it sometimes. But that's like what we're called to do, to speak out, to speak truth to power, and to say that this won't stand. And it's like you said, it's a great quote that the world wins on Friday, but Sunday's coming.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. Well, he ends the presentation, which again is like 25 pages long, by saying God's purposes are certain. They may remove a Tutu. They may remove the South African Council of Churches, but God's intention to establish his kingdom of justice, of love, of compassion will not be thwarted, which is both moving and somewhat funny because, maybe the government hates tutus.
I mean, how can you hate tutus?
I know. And then he quotes Romans 8, which is just like, if he was trying to write a speech that just hits all of my like happy points, this is just right there.
He wasn't aware when he wrote this how Megan coded this would be.
He was not. This was a good 6 months before I was born. But yeah, the whole thing is extremely Megan coded. I want to I'm going to find a random passerby and make them stand there while I read this whole thing at them. So listeners, be really happy that I'm not doing that to you.
I make a pledge to you now, listeners, that I will not make Megan read the entirety of this in a bonus episode for you to listen to. I understand it is available for you to read at your leisure.
It is.
It's worth a read. It's worth your time, but we're not going to do it here on the show.
Hope and Suffering by Desmond Tutu, prefaced by Trevor Huddleston. It's out of print, but it's easily track downable.
So, as we wrap this up, as we do, I need your opinion on something.
Okay.
We are in the throes of the holiday season, and I always hate kind of lumping that stuff in because I don't want to neglect the importance of the holy days that we are approaching in our Christian faith. But there's one very important piece of information that we need from you.
Okay.
Whether it's Thanksgiving, which is upon us, or Christmas, I need you to think about what is the one thing that you would take off either the Thanksgiving table or the Christmas table. But it can't be like a throwaway thing. It can't be I'm going to get rid of fruitcake. So you got to think of one thing that you actually like that you have to take off the table.
Does gravy count?
I feel like that's too easy of an answer. I feel you can get away without gravy. But
I don't like gravy is the thing. I would remove mashed potatoes.
Ooh.
I feel like they're kind of basic. We can do more. There are some more high value sides that are competing for that space.
That's fair.
I would do mashed potatoes.
See, my controversial take is, and it's not that it's always bad, I firmly attest that turkey as a meat should only be used in sandwiches, and turkey as a centerpiece in any meal is garbage because white turkey meat is gross. It's always dry.
Yeah.
Dark turkey meat gets taken by everybody. So I say we get rid of it. There's way better things that you can use as a center dish. But if I have to say something the one thing I would probably have to give up, I'm going to say stuffing. I feel like I can sacrifice stuffing. I don't want to go with my initial instinct was to give up a dessert, but this side of the podcast is very pro pumpkin pie. And I can't give up pumpkin pie.
Oh, huh. See, I don't like pumpkin pie.
See, then you wouldn't have a problem with it.
Yeah. I goodbye pumpkin pie. I don't understand it. The texture is weird. I don't care for it.
This breaks my heart, Megan. This hurts me, and it affects our relationship at a very deep and personal level. Well, friends, we thank you for joining us on the show. Do us a favor, like I always say, on the way out the door, hit subscribe, leave us a rating and a review because it helps people find out about the show, and we can't wait to talk to you next time on For the Rest of Us. Thanks for stopping by and checking out For the Rest of Us with Ken and Megan. If you like the show, maybe subscribe, share it with a friend, leave us a review, and we hope to see you again next time. For the Rest of Us is a production of the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York.